He fired her for dancing with his daughter. But when he found the letter from his wife, it was too late. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Right where you are watching from. The Lancaster estate was a place where sound had long ago been exiled. The halls stretched wide and tall, echoing only the muffled steps of staff and the occasional creak of ancient wood. It was a home built to impress. Marble floors, towering bookshelves, chandeliers that shimmered like stilled rain. But now it resembled more a mausoleum than a home. The grand piano in the drawing room sat untouched. The dining table that could seat 20 hosted only silence, and the sprawling gardens, visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, bloomed without witnesses. Edward Lancaster stood at the top of the staircase each morning like a monument of grief in a suit. His presence carried the sharp authority of a man who had mastered boardrooms and broken markets. Yet within the walls of his home, he moved like a ghost, trying not to wake the past. It had been 11 months since the accident. 11 months since the crash that had taken Catherine, his wife, and left their daughter Lily paralyzed from the waist down. She had been 9 at the time. She still was, though in many ways she seemed older now. Aged by silence, by grief, by a kind of isolation no child should have to understand. Lily hadn't spoken a full sentence since the funeral. She communicated only in glances, the occasional tilt of her head and long, blank stares through the windows. Her once bright laugh, the one that used to ring through the corridors as she danced barefoot in the drawing room, was gone. In its place was the mechanical hum of her wheelchair, the beep of medical monitors, and the low murmurs of therapists explaining what progress looked like on paper. Edward had spared no expense. The best neurologists from Boston, psychologists from Switzerland, and physical therapists from Los Angeles had come and gone through the mansion's doors. Each arrived with promises and polite optimism. Each departed quietly, defeated by the blank expression of the girl who would not respond. Money, for all its power, had met its match. It was James, Edward's assistant, who brought the suggestion forward during a late-night email exchange. A woman named Mabel Johnson was available through a private agency. She had worked in family homes for years, especially where children were involved. Her references were spotless, though oddly vague about her early career. She was 70 years old, calm, unassuming, and, James had noted, very good in quiet homes. Edward didn't even meet her in person. He simply nodded when James asked for approval. A cook was just a cook. Mabel arrived one Monday morning in a pale blue coat and brown leather shoes that creaked softly on the marble. Her face was lined but kind, framed by a crown of white curls tied back in a bun. She greeted the butler with a smile, nodded gently to the housekeeper, and was shown the kitchen without ceremony. She unpacked her knives with care and placed a worn leather-bound recipe journal on the counter. No one noticed, except perhaps one pair of watching eyes from the hallway. By lunchtime, the mansion smelled of cinnamon and vanilla. The scent drifted upward and sideways, creeping through the halls like a memory, curling beneath doorways and under the wheels of a forgotten chair. In the corner of her bedroom, Lily blinked and sniffed once. The smell was unfamiliar, and yet it tugged at something distant and warm. She turned her head slightly toward the door, listening. Downstairs, Mabel moved with the grace of someone who had danced in kitchens for decades. She hummed softly, an old jazz tune, one only she seemed to remember. As she stirred, chopped, and measured, her movements fell into rhythm. She clapped flour from her hands and let her hips sway gently to the beat only she could hear. When the cookies were done, she plated them carefully, 3 per dish, and set one tray aside for the little girl upstairs. The next morning, Lily appeared at the edge of the kitchen in her chair, silent and watching. She hadn't come this close to the heart of the house in weeks. Mabel noticed her but said nothing, only turned down the radio slightly and adjusted the tray of ingredients on the counter. The girl's eyes followed every movement. Mabel picked up a wooden spoon and tapped it twice on the edge of the bowl, then 3 times. Lily's fingers twitched slightly on the armrest. "You know," Mabel said casually, her voice low and warm, "when I was little, my mama told me that rhythm lives in your elbows, doesn't need feet. You just gotta find it." She began to move again, just a step or two in place. enough to shift her weight side to side as she cracked eggs and rolled dough. It wasn't a dance, not really, and yet it was. Lily's gaze locked onto her hands, her shoulders, her humming mouth. "You like music?" Mabel asked, not expecting an answer. There was none, but Lily didn't leave. By the end of the week, the girl returned each morning. Mabel started leaving a seat for her at the corner of the counter, a cloth napkin, and a small dish with a single chocolate chip cookie. On the fourth day, Lily reached out and took it without being prompted. On the fifth, she clapped once, softly, uncertainly, but clearly in time with the music. The staff began to notice. The housekeeper whispered to the butler that the girl was smiling now, or almost. James passed on a comment to Edward, but the man dismissed it. He was late for a conference call. He had investors to calm and markets to chase. Then came the moment. It was a Sunday. The mansion was still, the sun pouring through tall windows in golden ribbons. From the drawing room, faint strains of music floated. Old jazz again, not loud, but rhythmic. Edward stepped inside, loosening his tie. What he saw stopped him cold. There, in the center of the room, was Lily, in her chair. Her arms were raised just slightly, swaying gently. In front of her stood Mabel, her back straight, feet gliding across the polished floor with a delicacy that belied her age. She held one hand out toward the girl, and the two moved together, one spinning slowly, the other clapping in time. Lily's face was radiant. It was not just a smile. It was joy, pure, unfiltered, and alive. "Stop that immediately!" Edward's voice thundered across the room. The music halted mid-note. Mabel froze, her hand still extended. Lily flinched. The girl's smile vanished, her arms dropping to her lap. Mabel turned slowly to face him, calm but firm. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Edward demanded, striding across the floor. "She is paralyzed. This isn't therapy, it's performance. This is not what you were hired to do." Lily began to cry. The tears were silent, rolling down her cheeks without sound or sob. Mabel lowered her head slightly and turned off the radio. "I was teaching her to feel rhythm," she said quietly. "To feel like she still has a body that can move." "You're a cook," Edward snapped. "Not a therapist, not a dancer. Don't you dare overstep." "I'm sorry, sir," Mabel said simply. "I want you gone by this evening. This is unacceptable." Mabel nodded once. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She turned to Lily and gave a small smile, her eyes soft. "How many butterflies fly differently, sugar?" she whispered, "but they still fly." She left the room as silently as she had entered the house a week ago. Edward stood there, breathing heavily, refusing to look at his daughter. But even as he tried to justify his decision, a small part of him twisted, tightened, in a way he couldn't define. Lily's chair creaked softly as she turned away from him, her back rigid, her shoulders trembling. That night, the mansion returned to silence. But now, it was heavier than before. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was loss layered upon loss, and Edward, standing at the window, could no longer tell whether he had protected his daughter or betrayed her. The silence that followed Mabel's departure was not the same as the silence that had existed before her. It was thicker, almost suffocating, like fog clinging to every surface of the Lancaster mansion. It was no longer the stillness of mourning, but of something broken that no one dared name. The scent of cinnamon had long faded from the halls, replaced once again by the sterile cleanliness of polished wood and disinfected rooms. But absence, as Edward soon learned, had its own kind of weight, and this one was not evenly distributed. Lily had not spoken to anyone since the day Mabel was dismissed. Not that she had said anything before, but now it was more than silence. It was withdrawal. Her eyes, once at least curious in their stillness, now seemed dulled, as if a small flame had flickered and gone out. Meals were left untouched on the tray beside her bed. The physical therapist reported that she wouldn't even lift her arms during sessions, as though her body had given up the act of pretending. She refused music, refused sunlight, refused even the soft books with textured pages that used to distract her, if only for a few moments. James tried to speak to Edward about it. He approached gently, in that careful tone he had perfected over years of service. "Sir," he said one morning as Edward adjusted his cufflinks in the study, "I've noticed some changes in Miss Lily's behavior." Edward didn't look up from his reflection in the mirror. "She'll come around. It's a phase. She's a child, not a machine. Emotions are messy." "Yes, sir. Only, the staff says she hasn't left her room in 3 days. She needs discipline, not indulgence," Edward replied sharply. "And she needs proper care, not some dancing cook meddling in her recovery." James did not argue. He rarely did. But as he left the room, he paused briefly at the door, as if to say something more. Then he thought better of it and walked away. That afternoon, Edward passed Lily's room. The door was ajar, and from within came no sound. No whir of wheelchair wheels, no rustling of sheets. He paused, just for a moment, and looked inside. Lily was lying on her side, eyes open but unfocused, staring at the blank wall. Her cheeks were pale. There was a tray of untouched food beside her. A cookie sat alone on a small porcelain plate. He stepped inside, clearing his throat. She did not react. "Lily," he said, "are you comfortable? Do you need anything?" She blinked once, slowly, and said nothing. "Is there a reason you won't eat?" Her lips parted slightly. He leaned closer. "She made me feel like I was still real," she whispered. "You sent her away." Edward stood frozen, unsure whether he had truly heard her or imagined it. But she didn't speak again. She turned her face toward the wall, slowly and with effort, and her small hand crept up to clutch the edge of the blanket. He left the room in a haze of confusion. That night, he couldn't sleep. He paced the study long past midnight, trying to summon his usual confidence, but it wouldn't come. Instead, he poured himself a drink and wandered the house aimlessly, eventually finding himself outside the kitchen. The space was neat, clean, untouched. The same pots hung in the same places, but the room felt dead. Something caught his eye on the far counter. A leather-bound book. Her book. Mabel had forgotten it. He picked it up and opened the cover. Inside was a name written in flowing, careful script. Mabel Johnson. Recipes and notes. But it was far more than a cookbook. As he turned the pages, he found diagrams, rudimentary illustrations of children's bodies, with notations around muscles, pressure points, and sensory zones. There were notes in the margins: responds well to clapping rhythm, left hand stronger than right, suggest weighted spoon. It wasn't science, not as he understood it, but it wasn't guesswork either. It was observation, precise and deliberate. It was care. Then came a series of pages titled LL, each entry marked with the date. They began the day Mabel arrived. Lemon showed interest in scent today. Cinnamon, nutmeg. Pupils dilated, leaned forward. First sign of curiosity. Ept, once to 3-beat rhythm. Timid but coordinated. Motor response seems linked to auditory stimulation. He smiled. Fool, lasted 5 seconds, witnessed by staff. Edward read on, flipping through page after page of careful notations. The last entry, dated the day before Mabel was fired, simply read, "She danced." At the back of the book, tucked inside a sleeve, was a faded photograph. His breath caught in his throat. It was Catherine. She looked radiant, her hair pulled back, her hands cradling her pregnant belly. Standing beside her, arm looped around her shoulder, was a younger Mabel, beaming. They were in a kitchen, not this one, but somewhere smaller, warmer. On the back of the photo was a note, written in Catherine's hand. To Mabel, if anything ever happens, be near my girl. She'll need you more than she knows. Edward sank into a chair, the book still open in his lap. His hands trembled. He remembered now, vaguely, that Catherine had attended a culinary therapy retreat in Brooklyn when she was pregnant. She had come back glowing, filled with ideas about sensory learning and food as medicine. He had humored her at the time, filed it away as another one of her passions. He hadn't realized she'd kept in touch with anyone from that program. The next day, he called the agency, demanding contact information. They refused. Privacy concerns, they said. The client requested no forwarding. He called James into his office. "I need you to find her." James raised an eyebrow. "Miss Johnson?" "Yes. Find out where she lives, where she worked before, everything." James hesitated. "May I ask why?" Edward didn't answer right away. Then he said, more to himself than anyone, "Because I may have made a mistake." James nodded once. "Give me an hour." He returned sooner than that, holding a printed page. "She's not just a cook," James said, placing the paper on the desk. "Her early record shows she worked in New York for a nonprofit that taught children with disabilities how to cook and dance. Therapeutic routines, low funding, shut down a few years ago. Why wasn't that on her resume?" She didn't include it, but I found articles, photos. She used to run a weekly program called Kitchen Steps, music, movement, food therapy. Edward scanned the article. There was Mabel, laughing, holding the hands of a boy in a wheelchair as they moved together on a makeshift dance floor. James continued, "She left the public eye after losing her granddaughter in an accident. Her name was Ava. 5 years old." Edward leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. So much he hadn't known. So much he had refused to know. That evening, he stood outside Lily's door again. Inside, she was curled on her side, her hand clutching a worn blanket. On her nightstand was a paper butterfly, folded from one of the cookie recipe pages Mabel used to leave out. It was clumsily made, one wing crooked, but carefully preserved. "She said I could still fly," Lily whispered into the silence, not knowing he was there. He stood frozen in the hallway, eyes closed, hearing his daughter's voice for the second time in a week, and knowing with painful clarity that he had banished the one person who had found a way to reach her. The house, once again, was too quiet. But now the silence was his alone. Edward had never been a man who struggled with decisions. His life had been a string of actions taken swiftly and with authority. Deals closed, contracts signed, futures altered. But standing at the front gate of a modest home on the outskirts of town, he felt something unfamiliar weigh down his chest. The gate was simple wood, painted white and chipped in places. A clay pot overflowing with geraniums sat beside the entrance. The smell of bread baking drifted faintly through the evening air. He hesitated for a long moment before pushing the gate open. The creak it made was small, but to Edward it echoed like an accusation. He stepped onto the path lined with irregular stepping stones, each one hand-laid, uneven, and yet purposeful. The front porch was tidy, adorned with a faded rocking chair and a wind chime made from silver spoons that tinkled lightly in the breeze. He raised his hand to knock on the door, then paused, adjusted his jacket, and knocked twice. When the door opened, Mabel stood there in a pale yellow cardigan and a soft cotton dress, her apron still dusted with flour. Her face showed no surprise. She looked at him as one might look at an overdue visitor, not unkindly, but with the quiet certainty that he would arrive eventually. "I thought it might be you," she said, stepping aside. "You look tired." Edward entered without answering. The inside of the house was as modest as the outside, cozy, warm, filled with a scent of yeast and something sweet. The living room had a worn couch covered in knitted blankets, a bookshelf bursting with cookbooks and children's stories, and a lamp that cast a golden glow across the walls. "I want to talk," he said finally. "I figured," Mabel replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sit down. I'll make tea." He sat stiffly on the edge of the couch while she moved into the kitchen. He could hear the clink of porcelain, the hiss of the kettle, the soft notes of a radio playing something soulful in the background. It was a scene from another life. A simpler world where everything didn't have to be dissected, analyzed, controlled. When she returned, she placed a steaming cup in front of him. Chamomile, no sugar, no cream. He didn't object. "I found your journal," he said after a long silence. "Your notes on Lily." She didn't react. She simply sat across from him in her rocking chair, her hands folded in her lap. "I read the last entry. She danced." "She did," Mabel said quietly. "It was the smallest thing, just her arms and a smile, but it was real." I didn't know, he admitted. About your background. About Ava. Her eyes closed briefly. You weren't meant to. Why? He asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Why would you hide who you were? Why let me treat you like just another employee? Because that's what you were ready for, she said. Men like you don't let in people who come with stories. You hire help. You don't hire healers, especially ones that don't come with white coats and framed degrees. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking slightly. She's not eating, he said. She barely moves. She talks to the wall, says you made her feel real, that you made her believe she could still fly. Mabel's eyes softened, and she leaned forward. I never lied to her, she said. And I never promised what I couldn't give, but I did believe in her. That's something children know. They feel it. Not through words, through presence, through music, through food, through love. He swallowed hard. I found a photograph, he said, of you and Catherine. I'd forgotten she went to that retreat. We met there, Mabel nodded. She was full of fire, asked more questions than the rest of them put together. She was carrying Lily then, said she wanted her child to grow up in a world where healing came from more than medicine. She never told me, Edward whispered. Or maybe she tried. Maybe I didn't listen. She told me about you, Mabel said gently. Said you were brilliant, driven, but scared of things you couldn't fix. He let out a bitter laugh. She knew me better than I did. Mabel stood and walked to a cabinet in the corner. She opened a small drawer and took out a sealed envelope, aged and yellowing. She returned to him and placed it in his hands. She gave me this before she left the retreat, told me to give it to you only when the time was right. He stared at the handwriting on the front, Catherine's, slanted, elegant, unmistakable. He opened it slowly. The letter was short, no more than a page, but every word struck deep. Edward, if you're reading this, it means things didn't go the way we planned. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm still there beside you. But just in case, I need you to know something. Lily is special. I don't mean in the way every mother believes her child is special. I mean her heart, her spirit. They see the world in a way we don't. And if the world ever becomes too heavy for her, I want you to let someone help carry it. Mabel knows how to carry pain and turn it into something beautiful. Trust her. She will see Lily when no one else can, including you. Stop trying to fix her. Just love her. Catherine. Edward lowered the letter, his eyes wet. Mabel remained silent, letting the weight of the words settle. I thought I was protecting her, he said, by keeping her in control, by giving her the best. You were protecting yourself, Mabel replied, from feeling helpless. But sometimes children don't need you to fix their broken parts. They just need to know they're still whole in your eyes. He looked up at her, voice cracking. I need you to come back. Mabel shook her head gently. That's not how this works. I'm asking, he said. And I'm telling you, if I come back, it's not as a cook. It's not as help. It's as someone who loves your daughter and who will not be told again that she doesn't belong. Then come back as that, he said. Come back as the one person who's reached her. I'll stay out of your way if I have to. She gave him a long look. Then she spoke, slow and clear. If I come back, you don't stay out of the way. You join in. You clap. You move. You make mistakes. You let her see her father is brave enough to look foolish for her. He exhaled. Anything, just come back. Mabel nodded, stood, and went to gather her coat. She paused beside the bookshelf, pulled a small CD case from between the volumes, and held it out. Bring this with you tomorrow, she said. We'll need it for her first lesson. The drive back to the mansion was quiet. The roads blurred past him, but his mind was fixed on the letter in his lap. Catherine's voice lingered in his head. Just love her. When he arrived home, it was near midnight. He climbed the stairs and went to Lily's room. The light was dim. She was awake, staring at the ceiling. He entered quietly and sat beside her. She wrote me a letter, he said. Your mom. She told me to stop trying to fix you. Lily turned her head slowly. Her eyes met his. She told me to let you fly. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she reached for his hand. Will she come back? He nodded. She's coming tomorrow. Lily smiled, just slightly. She said we're butterflies, she whispered, even if our wings are different. The next morning, for the first time in months, Edward laid out his own clothes, not for a meeting or a deal, but for something far more important. He chose soft shoes, a shirt without a tie, and as he passed the kitchen, he heard it again, the sound he hadn't realized he missed. Music. A slow, sweet melody. Mabel was home. By the time the morning sun spilled into the Lancaster kitchen the following day, the house no longer felt like a museum to sorrow. The light seemed warmer somehow, clinging not just to surfaces but to the spaces between them. The once sterile counters bore signs of life again, flour dusted here and there, a bowl left to soak, the faint scent of vanilla lingering in the air. And at the center of it all stood Mabel Johnson, her sleeves rolled, her hair tied back in its familiar bun, humming as she shaped dough with quiet concentration. Her movements were slower than they'd once been, but there was a rhythm to them that was unmistakable, a grace that came from knowing every step by heart. Lily was already in the kitchen, seated at the end of the long island counter. Her hands were busy whisking a small bowl of eggs, and her face bore the hint of a smile so gentle it might have been mistaken for a daydream, but it was real. She glanced occasionally at Mabel, not for guidance, but for comfort. The girl no longer needed coaxing to participate. She was drawn into the ritual of the kitchen like a musician slipping into a familiar melody. Edward stood in the doorway, watching in silence. He no longer hid his presence when he observed them. There was no shame in witnessing this kind of magic. When Lily noticed him, she didn't look away. She smiled, openly this time, and gestured for him to come closer. You said you'd help today, she reminded him softly. He nodded, walked over, and took the whisk from her hands. I did, he said, and then, with a crooked smile, but I might need a little instruction. Mabel handed him a bowl of batter. Start with folding, not stirring. Gentle hands, Mr. Lancaster. Pancakes don't like aggression. Noted, he said, mimicking her technique with awkward earnestness. Later that morning, after breakfast was served and the dishes cleaned, Mabel turned on the small radio that now lived on the kitchen windowsill. The song was soft, the melody slow and sweeping, the kind of tune that asked for movement, not demanded it. Lily's hands rested on her lap, her eyes closed as she let the music wash over her. Mabel stepped beside her and offered a hand. We can try again, she said. Only if you want to. Lily nodded. She placed her small hand in Mabel's weathered one, and together they moved. Mabel swayed gently, her own body guiding the rhythm. Lily's arms followed. Her chair turned slowly, gracefully, like the pivot of a dancer on stage. The movements were minimal, but they were hers. Edward stood nearby, watching. His eyes stung, not with guilt this time, but with awe. This was more than therapy. It was something sacred. When Mabel gestured for him to join, he hesitated. She needs to see you believe in it, Mabel said, her voice soft but firm. Not just in her, but in the movement, in the moment. He stepped forward, unsure of his limbs, unsure of his place in this quiet choreography. But when Lily looked up at him and held out her hand, the hesitation vanished. He took her hand, placed his other gently on the back of her chair, and followed the rhythm. His movements were clumsy, but his presence was sure. They danced, together. Weeks passed, and what had started as an act of connection became a daily ritual. The kitchen became a classroom of warmth and rhythm. Mabel taught them not just recipes, but trust. With each day, Lily's strength grew, not only in body, but in spirit. She began attempting small, standing exercises with assistance. Her arms grew stronger, her posture more confident. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but even they admitted that something intangible had shifted. It was Lily who suggested the project. She called it Butterflies in the Kitchen. One morning, while sitting with Mabel and Edward at the breakfast table, She laid out her idea with the clarity and conviction of someone who had found her voice. "There are other kids like me," she said, "kids who think they can't dance or laugh or move. What if we made a place where they could come and do what we do here, where music plays all day and the food is always warm, a place where it doesn't matter if you can't walk, because someone will still hold your hand and dance with you?" Mabel looked at Edward, her eyes bright. "Well," she said, "you heard the lady." Within months, the first outlines of the project took form. Edward used his influence, his contacts, and his resources not to build another corporate monument, but something with heart. They converted one of his family's unused properties into a center, part kitchen, part dance studio, part community gathering space. Mabel called it a sanctuary. Edward called it a beginning. They trained staff, brought in specialists who were willing to listen rather than dictate, and above all, Mabel became the soul of the place. Her methods were unorthodox, yes. She preferred music to silence, stories to instructions, touch to charts, but the results were undeniable. Children who had been labeled unreachable began responding. A girl with spina bifida danced with wooden spoons. A boy with severe trauma found comfort in shaping dough beside Mabel, his hands finely steadying. Parents came with skepticism and left with tears. Lily thrived. She became the center's ambassador, often seen moving gracefully through the halls in her chair or walking short distances with crutches. She taught younger children how to stir without spilling, how to feel rhythm in their shoulders, how to smile even when they felt unsure. One evening, after a long day of sessions and laughter, Lily sat beside her father in the courtyard of the center. The stars were beginning to blink into view. "You know," she said, "I thought you'd never dance with me." "I thought I couldn't," Edward admitted. "I thought it had to be perfect or not at all." "But it doesn't," she said. "It just has to be together." He reached for her hand. "I'm proud of you," he said. "And I'm grateful for everything, for Mabel, for your mother's letter, for second chances." "She knew," Lily said. "Mom, she knew what we needed even before we did." "She always did." The official opening of Butterflies in the Kitchen was held exactly 1 year from the day Mabel returned. The center was filled with families, staff, volunteers, and the scent of warm bread and fresh herbs. Mabel wore a soft blue dress and her favorite apron. Edward gave a speech that ended with a simple truth. "I spent years thinking I could fix everything with money, but it was kindness that saved my daughter, and a woman who reminded us that love doesn't knock politely, it dances into the room uninvited and shows us how to breathe again." When Lily took the stage that night, she wore a dress of pale yellow, the same color as the cardigan Mabel had worn the day Edward visited her home. She danced to the song that had played on that first day in the kitchen. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and breathtaking. Afterward, as applause filled the hall, Lily stood at the microphone. "2 years ago, I thought I was broken," she said, "but Miss Mabel told me something I'll never forget. She said, 'Some butterflies fly differently, but they still fly.' And now I know she was right." Edward stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and looked out at the faces in the crowd. He saw the children, the parents, the therapists, the volunteers. He saw a community he never thought he'd be part of. And beside them all stood Mabel Johnson, her hands clasped, her eyes wet, her heart full. From that day on, the Lancaster mansion was no longer silent. It rang with laughter, footsteps, music, and the clatter of dishes from a kitchen that never truly closed. The place that had once been a shrine to grief became a sanctuary of joy. And at its heart was a lesson far greater than anything Edward had learned in boardrooms or balance sheets. That love is not measured in outcomes, but in effort. That healing is not always clinical, it can be messy and warm and wrapped in the scent of cinnamon. And that sometimes the most extraordinary miracles come not from those with the highest degrees, but from those who dare to dance when no one else will. And, honored to dance with you today, most of these miracles predate things like global warming when no one else will. Because even the smallest wings can lift a soul, even the quietest song can change a life, and even a girl in a wheelchair can fly. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share this video with someone who needs a little hope today and stay tuned. More stories are waiting for you.